Hello, I'm Maria Hall Brown. Welcome to another edition of Protest and Promise, a remarkable opportunity to hear the voices of young Angelenos and allow them to ask questions and offer insight to our civic leaders. And one of those remarkable people is here today. I'm delighted to be joined by the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at USC. He's a scholar, an author, and an incredibly interesting person. Hello, Jody Armour.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with you.
I'm so glad you're here. And also our panel, our wonderful young people. We have Allison. Hi, Allison. We have
Hello.
Alexis.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome back, Camry. Hello, Nick.
Hello.
Hello, and Dory.
Good afternoon, everyone.
All right, so today's topics are pretty impressive and pretty impactful on everyone's lives, and they hold a lot of interesting components to them, and they're very complex. We're going to talk about cancel culture, which is hard to say, and critical race theory. I think the thing that I would really love to know straight off the bat, and I know that some of you have asked this too, how do you define both of those phrases? I mean, what do they mean to you specifically?
Yeah, critical race theory means so many different things to so many different folks, right? It's like a Rorschach ink blot test, you know, that the psychologists throw up there and they tell you more about the observer than what's being observed, you know, when they interpret what's in that ink blot. Well, you look at what we're talking about now, and we've moved from kind of defund the police and the George Floyd moment now to a different battlefront for the culture wars, and that is critical race theory. What is it? Is it now just an empty slogan? You know, does it have any real content? I was one of the first folks to write critical race theory when I entered the academy back in 1990. In 1989, there was a conference in Wisconsin that brought together a lot of young Black, Latino, Asian, white scholars interested in critical race theory. And 1990 to 2000 was really kind of the heyday of a lot of the writing at the time. And what we were doing was, with critical race theory, trying to explain why the civil rights movement hadn't brought us racial equality. Right? We fought for formal equality. We fought against segregation. We got rid of Jim Crow. All the laws, Brown versus Board of Education, keeping separate schools, no longer constitutional. Racially restrictive covenants in leases like we had in LA, no longer enforceable. So we got rid of all the formal inequality, and yet there was so much continuing racial inequality in America. You looked around you in the 70s and the 80s, and it was still there. So much of the Black community had not been delivered by the civil rights movement, and so people started wondering why. And there were one of two explanations that people tended to come up with, right? Number one, Black people are just inferior. When they're given an opportunity to rise without formal inequality, they don't rise to the top because they're inferior. You have people like Charles Murray in The Bell Curve, his best-selling book, The Bell Curve, argue that Black people were genetically less intelligent than non-Blacks. You have today still, magazines like Quillette that has a lot of skull-measuring racists, I would call them, or skull-measuring, intelligence people trying to explain racial inequality in terms of Black people's natural inferiority, right? That's one explanation. The other explanation is the one we started coming up with critical race theory, which is that even after you've achieved formal equality so people can drink at the same water fountains and go to the same bathrooms, it doesn't mean that you've dealt with the legacy of racism that can continue from the time that you had formal inequality and formal racism. And now, how do we address that legacy? And that's all we were really talking about, and that seems to be what's so offensive. to people a lot of times because they seem to hear us saying, or they caricature critical race theory as saying one of two things. One, that all white people are villains. Somehow, they're historical villains, right? Which is not, of course, what critical race theory is saying. My own mother is from what used to be Queenstown, Ireland, flaming red-headed Irish American woman, right? I love her to death, and yet when we talk about this, she understood that she was raising Black children in America, and we were going to deal with certain kinds of experiences because of our race, right? And that's what critical race theory is talking about, not villainizing whites, number one. And number two, they seem to find, a lot of critics of critical race theory find it offensive that it seems to suggest that America was racist at its foundation, right? That seems to really bother them. But I can't see how you can look at the Constitution and see that in the Constitution, Black people are property, don't have any human rights, right? Number one, and that many of the founders and drafters of the Constitutions were themselves slave owners, right? So I don't know how we cannot say that racism was at the foundation of America. Now, we had a second American Revolution, that was the Civil War, that made good on the promises of the first. It extended those promises of liberty and equality to Black people, right? But that took a second American Revolution and 600,000 dead Americans in a cataclysmic race war. So that is what critical race theory is really getting at. And I can talk about all of the other things it's being called, but that's what it's really getting at.
Do any of you actually, have you been impacted by any of this verbiage that's going around in social media or any of the things that you're watching on the news, if you're watching the news, or anything that you're reading? I mean, have you been more aware of this subject matter than in, earlier years? Dory?
I do attend a historical Black college and university. That's the talk of the town, 24/7. We talk about it. We have these conversations because at the end of the day, as students who go to historical Black college and university, we have this prerogative to put forward and highlight these issues, especially when it comes to legacy racism, because that seems to be the issue that is making America go into turmoil, causing another race war, another civil war, if you want to have more of a correct term of what's going on. But yeah, we're hugely impacted by what's going on with critical race theory, in that we find it important that we must continue to teach these ideologies so that we can inform students about what happened in America and how we can change it for the near future.
Nick, you've graduated, so you're a little bit past the educational aspect of all of this, but through your education, were you aware of these subjects, and was it something that actually made you stand up and think? I mean, how was your educational experience, and did you feel as if these very important topics were clearly and succinctly delineated?
So at least when I was, I think, kind of thinking back like the last 2 years kind of my, of university is kind of when a lot of this started to come up in terms of the classes that I was taking and stuff. I don't remember if there was kind of any sort of formalized discussion of something like critical race theory as as a defined idea. Definitely there were elements of what was kind of brought up, especially there was a class that I had taken specifically basically about race in colonial America, and a lot of these topics and kind of stuff about the legacies of things and original pieces of legislation, not just the Constitution, but original kind of state charters and certain things. A lot of it was brought up, but it wasn't brought up, I suppose, under kind of as formalized of an umbrella as kind of we're seeing be discussed now.
Right. Allison, I know that you had a question for Professor Armour about whether we're moving forward or not.
Since critical race theory has become a part of everyday life and is kind of being discussed about in politics now and being seen as a divisive issue, would you say we're kind of critically approaching it in a way where it's beneficial for society, or are conservatives or people who are attacking it attempting to devolve it as a way to try to preserve, I guess, their heritage in a way, or as you were saying, kind of in a way to see it as a critique or an attack on them?
Yeah, it's viewed not as a, reflection on history, a reckoning with our own history. Let's get to the facts. Facts don't care about your feelings, so let's look at what the facts really say for themselves. Rather than assuming that attitude, which would be an evidence-based attitude, and the kind of attitude we had to adopt in critical race theory. As I've been writing it through the years, in every one of my articles, I have to have copious receipts, copious footnotes and citations, right? Because I can't just say something, I have to support it with empirical evidence and that sort of thing. So, the hope is here that as people become more focused on getting to the facts and beyond the rhetoric, we can start to make some progress. What you find in, for example, studies that are done over and over is that many Americans, most white Americans, 56% typically the polls show, believe that there's no longer racial discrimination in America, anti-black racial discrimination. It roughly hovers around 56%, 54, 58% routinely, right? Well, that is empirically, demonstrably false, right? You can break out the statistics, right? You can walk through, for example, our own Skid Row here in LA, the highest concentration of houseless folks in America. I would call it the fiercest expression of structural violence in America. And you look to the left and right and you see that 75% of the faces are black, even though the population in California, black population is under 9%, under 8% really, right? So that's telling you that the black community is bearing the brunt of a lot of systemic American problems, and we have to confront that, but we have to acknowledge that it's there factually. And right now, there are some arguing that we shouldn't even factually acknowledge that. That's critical race theory. If you acknowledge that, if you start talking about race, that's divisive. That divides us, and we don't want to divide one another. So stop talking about race, and it will go away. But that's the problem. It hasn't gone away, right? It just seems to get worse. Over 50 years ago, when we thought the civil rights movement would deliver a lot of equality for black folks, the income earning gap between blacks and whites is the same as it was 50 years ago, and the wealth gap has grown over the last 50 years between blacks and whites, right? So in those kind of bottom line ways, we have to make progress, but we can't make progress without acknowledging the truth.
Okay, I'm going to call Cam-Marie out on this because she's a young filmmaker, and this whole subject of race and racism, et cetera, has become, very important to her and what she's been working on. So, Cam-Marie, what have you seen in your life that either reflects, supports, or even maybe contradicts what Jody's saying?
I feel like when we talk about critical race theory and people misinterpreting it and semantics and language, we're really missing like the true point. And that is that it pays to like have black people at the bottom, essentially. It pays to hate black people. It pays for black people to be at the bottom suffering, because that's what made America what it is now, that everybody benefits from.
Well, one of the insights of critical race theory is that prejudiced attitudes have declined over the last 100 years. 100 years ago, for example, many more people were willing to openly express prejudiced attitudes, prejudiced anti-black attitudes. Then it started going down around 60 years ago, considerably, 50 years ago, 40. And you have many fewer people now who will say they endorse a Ku Klux Klan platform. Ku Klux Klan actually used to be something that you could be in political office and a member of, and nobody had a problem with it, right? But now attitudes have really changed. So you have a lot of conscious prejudice has declined, but one of the things that critical race theory points out is that unconscious bias can persist even after the conscious prejudice goes down or, is diminished a lot. And so that can explain a lot of the resistance to integration and to black advancement that we see, even on the part of racially liberal people. That is, people who are trying to do the right thing, want to do the right thing, often unconsciously sabotage their own efforts at racial equality because of unconscious bias. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the core insights of critical race theory. So it's not quite as pessimistic as what you say, although I've heard that position too, that there is a lot of intentional behavior about going on when it comes to black oppression. Certainly COINTELPRO was intentional. Fred Hampton, shout out to the movie on him, The Black Messiah, Judas and the Black Messiah. That was all very intentional, right? We know that. But one of the insights of critical race theory is that kind of intentional discrimination and racism is going down. You even have black people who a lot of times who are in those decision-making roles now, right? But you still see a lot of unconscious bias that is explaining the persistence. So I would be a little more optimistic in one way than you in saying that there's less intentional wrongdoing against blacks going on, but I'm more pessimistic in another way because I'm saying so much of it is unconscious, and it's really hard to change unconscious mental reflexes.
Right.
Once it gets to the level of the cognitive unconscious.
So we're talking about this subject as a theoretical subject, but now it's also taking on a tangible component to it where it's actually being called, part of curricula when it comes to education. And, there's a fight about, we're not going to have that kind of curricula in our elementary schools. We're not going to have that kind of, curricula in this part of the country, et cetera, et cetera. Is there actually curricula that is being introduced into elementary schools that somehow may or may not be an issue? Or is that just another, I don't want to call it subterfuge, or is that just another diversion tactic? That it's really a concept and not a curricula?
Yeah, as you've heard me explain some of critical race theory just now about how it deals with the unconscious bias, colorblind formalism, attacks colorblind formalism, that is graduate school stuff, right? That's stuff that we developed in law school for graduate students. And yes, they're even taking it on in colleges. But you're not talking to grade school and middle school kids about these kind of rarefied jurisprudential theories that we're talking about here.
Right.
What people are calling critical race theory is anything that mentions race as a factor that explains what's going on in America, why we have racial inequality in America, that there may actually be racial discrimination and bias that is driving racial inequality rather than the inferiority of blacks themselves. The explanation that people want to go to, some people want to go to, but others are over and are saying there are other explanations. We need to look at the history of America to understand where we are today. And a lot of folks don't want, their feeling is that if you say that America's foundation is rooted in racism, which you can't deny if you look at, the Constitution and slavery being part of it, then you are saying that it's wrong to be patriotic, that you don't love America, that you are saying, that a lot of people who are patriotic, celebrate the 4th of July, are deluded, right? Well, no. My dad was a Marine. He fought in the Second World War, proud Marine, 6 foot 8 inch, barrel-chested Marine, decorated, loved his country, celebrated 4th of July, even though when he came home, he faced oppression, racial oppression when he got back home. A lot of racial oppression, but he was able to see America as the promise of America rather than sometimes it's the way it is being lived by some people who are in control or in positions of power. He was able to, for example, use the Constitution to get prisoners out of prison and himself out of prison, drawing on the Constitution. So he used to say, I made the frozen circumstances dance by playing to them their own melody. Right? And that melody was the Constitutional Bill of Rights, and to be able to call it. So you just because you point out that America has challenges in its history and challenges to overcome and reparations perhaps to pay to reckon with its history of racism doesn't mean that you still don't have a lot of pride in the promise of America, in the hopes and dreams and aspirations of America.
Well, that's one of the biggest issues here is the divisive, that you almost have to choose choose a side, and you may or may not have to. So that's my question to Alexis. Alexis, in this whole realm, and I do want to get into cancel culture, but have you felt in your youth that you've had to pick a side, that somehow you are either for or against? You can't be willing to realize that might be more somewhat this, somewhat that?
Yeah, exactly. I felt the pressure of having to choose between like if you're Black or if you're American. I know definitely I went through a phase of like, do I even call myself African American? Because it has that connotation of, oh, I'm an American person, but historically they have treated Black people as being less inferior. So it's often that duality of trying to choose between those two like indicators. And I feel like I had that pressure of being able to choose, like, am I Black or am I African American? Because of that negative connotation of what it means to be an American, because you often, like you were discussing before, that it has to do with like being delusional to the historical legacy of slavery.
Oh, I feel you 100% though. You know, I call it the paradox of the Black patriot. You know, I used to say, look at my dad. I said, you're a patriot, and yet you came home to real serious racial oppression and discrimination from the country that you went and fought for and that you're wrapping your arms around now. I thought it was maybe some kind of Stockholm syndrome, you know, where captives fall in love with their captors, you know, somehow and start to identify with them or whatever. I thought it was a psychological disability, but I realized, no, it was actually a political commitment and statement my dad was making. He was saying, I have faith and confidence in where this country can go, what it can be, and I have some reason for that. And he was able to point to his own experience with getting people out of prison using the Constitution.
It's like you can't have both. You know, we're told that we can't have both. We have to choose between either or. And it's often like really debilitating because it's like, I am who I am, and this is a part of my whole identity. And especially you kind of got that cognitive dissonance when you witnessed the murder of George Floyd. It's like, how can I love my country? How can I be a part of this community when they can easily just kill this person like blindly in front of thousands of people, in front of the world actually? So it's just like, it's that process of finding who you are and loving who you are, but also being able to recognize the historical legacy of slavery and how that's impacted the way, you know, we've been able to view ourselves. So.
I'm seeing Allison nod. You know, are you feeling that Alexis is speaking sort of your truth too?
Yeah, I do kind of feel that sometimes as like, well, because like it does seem like, especially like I've come across this also like in my university in like Chicano studies, where it's like kind of like you have to embrace like either this totally like kind of a part of yourself that's recognized like the history that Latinos have faced, understand that like the way they were treated, and then like also are you allowed to like call yourself American when President Trump was in office and this was happening to a lot of undocumented immigrants, you know? It's like at the same time it's almost a similar situation, but you know, I don't want to say they're like exactly the same either, but I feel like the sentiment that Alexis feels as well, where it's kind of like as a minority you kind of feel like, are you allowed to choose to embrace an American identity, or you have to embrace kind of like where you're from, or like where people do not want to like embrace your identity at the same time in a sense?
Well, and that whole kind of leads into the cancel culture part of this, is because you have a very clear and accurate informational explanation of what cancel culture is. It was just sort of a way of making people take responsibility for their verbal and demonstrative actions in positions of authority. But it's come to mean something else. And it kind of reflects what they're saying to me now, is that making a choice and then pushing aside someone else's feelings and thoughts and just not even having them part of your existence. They're kind of interrelated, are they not?
Yeah, and cancel culture is, again, something that people don't define clearly, you know, like critical race theory, like defund the police, like Black Lives Matter. When it first came out as a slogan, people were like, all lives matter. No, don't just say Black Lives Matter. And then Blue Lives Matter. Oh, so you got it all along. Now you're just applying it to blue lives. Now it's okay. So when it comes to cancel culture, what do people mean? They mean lots of different things, you know, but one thing that it tends to be viewed as is something that the left does, that left-leaning liberals do, that they will, as part of cancel culture, keep certain speakers from coming onto campus, right? As part of cancel culture, say that there should be trigger warnings and we shouldn't have to be exposed to certain kinds of materials necessarily in the classroom, like the use of the N-word. That has come up in a number of law school settings, right? I'm not sure what we mean when we're talking just about, you know, cancel culture coming from the left, when we just seen Nicole Hannah-Jones, a black woman who had a Pulitzer Prize, MacArthur Genius Award, right? Helped develop and found the 1619 project that's been going into schools, right? She was denied a tenured position at University of North Carolina, her own alma mater, and abundantly qualified, overqualified woman for the position, if you will. The faculty, the provost, and everybody had supported her candidacy, but it got to the Board of Trustees, and the Board of Trustees said, we don't like that 1619 project, and they associated it with critical race theory, and stepped in front of her ability to get tenure until it blew up, stepped in front of her ability to get tenure at the journalism school. That's cancel culture. Right? That's cancel culture coming from the right. And there's a lot of that kind of cancel culture. When you have all these state legislatures saying you can't teach critical race theory in the schools, and by that we mean anything having to do with racial history, that's cancel culture. You're telling teachers what they cannot say in the classroom. That's coming from the right, though, right? So wherever we see cancel culture, we should be suspicious and pause and ask ourselves, really, what's going on here? Is it worth it? Are we cutting into freedom of expression too much in such a way that we may be hurting ourselves more than helping ourselves?
So Nick, yeah, I knew you were going to ask something. I felt it. Nick?
Well, it's funny because this is something that I think Cam Marie brought up that I think is really important is, you know, cancel culture rarely happens or even happens effectively face to face. Because you're kind of forced to be like, okay, this is like a person that I can have a discussion with, or I can disagree with, and I can have a conversation with. And I think that's one of the most, at least, like insidious efforts now, is it's become a very, and I think this was brought up, Professor Armour, is like it's a very insidious tool basically to keep difficult conversations from happening. And it's one of those things that at least I'm always very suspicious of efforts as well, kind of to stifle like legitimate free speech, right? I think, you know, sometimes people use free speech as kind of like a very, like, what does that mean? But I mean, I'm kind of talking sort of about like constitutionally protected free speech in this one. Like I come from like a split political family, and you have times in which things that may be done under one, for example, political administration, if it was done under the last one, there'd be people up in arms over it. Whereas like once it's basically your team that's getting to do it, it's like people, you know, it's like the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, they're just done. They can't see that it's happening, they refuse to admit it. And I think that's one of the biggest things is kind of in choosing like integrity over ideology when it comes to what values am I actually going to support? Like, hey, am I going to be somebody who tries to be a more free speech universalist and really not get on people, even for stuff, you know, they've said decades ago back when. So I really do agree with kind of your point of, you know, while it may be beneficial to one now, it was incredibly, you know, detrimental to that same person maybe just a couple years ago. And so it has to be like thought about critically.
How is it in your academic realm, Dory?
When we look at cancel culture, you know, we really got to think about, even in college, like, okay, things that we say and do, we have to be extremely careful about. And even though it may be harmless now, it can come back and harm us later. A lot of us now, even at Dillard University in New Orleans, which is an HBCU, we're very careful about our opinions and what we say when we're talking about serious topics for the fear that we might get canceled eventually.
Wow.
Which is really sad because now it overrides our freedom of speech. And once our freedom of speech is taken away and regulated, is it freedom of speech anymore? And are we looking at that? And are we canceling the correct things versus canceling anything and everything that might be offensive, which
Right.
truly may not be?
Actually, okay, so you have, oh, Allison, go ahead.
Yeah, and kind of like building off, I guess, Dory's like statement, like a lot of people nowadays are using like social media. And since like Professor Armour, you've been to college, you've kind of been through like our shoes in a sense. And like sometimes I feel like I can't freely speak in classrooms because I'm fearful of like maybe getting canceled or saying something offensive that might offend somebody and like causing like not even realizing I'm causing trouble without realizing it. So like, would you say like cancel culture like existed back in your day or some form of it where you felt like you had to silence yourself, Professor Armour? Or like, do you think that is becoming more of a modern problem that young people have to endure? Or has it kind of like always been around in like a subtle way
And
that
now
we don't
it's just
even
been
realize it?
named. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been given that another label, old wine in a new bottle. You know, a lot of times people have tried to control how people express themselves. People said when I first grew an afro, my students said, some of them, it was ironic that Professor Armour teaches criminal law while he looks like a criminal,
Oh, no.
right? So I've had to suffer certain kinds of consequences for my choice of follicle fashion, right? And that was before there was a word called cancel culture. You know, we know that there is going to be negative feedback that people are going to get for their, you know, for their self-expressions. So it's not really that new in that way. But I'll just throw this in real quickly. Accountability, too. Some of this is about accountability. Perhaps we should be accountable for some of the stuff we do at a certain age. I would, you know, like I said, I'm not going to look at what somebody's doing as a 13-year-old, right? But if you're 25 and you're going around saying screamingly misogynistic things, or screamingly racist thing, maybe you should pause, forget cancel culture, whatever you call it, you know, maybe you should think, maybe I should consider the consequences of this down the road.
Okay. All right. Well, this is ridiculous and that I should have to say this out loud, but we're running out of time. But what I really want to do is I want to go around and I want you all to ponder and think about what you want to offer Jody to carry with him from your hearts and mind, being young people who are living in a realm right now that has a lot of questions, a lot of confusion, but a lot of hope and promise, and what he can take with him in his work. So, Camry, what would you like Jody to take with him from you to think about, and you know, something that is impactful and important to you when it comes to either, you know, the issues of race or cancel culture or your world?
I'm really proud of you for using your experience with your father, you know, to like channel and influence you to go into the work that you're doing today and to create the work that you're creating that's going to, you know, be here forever. Thank you for challenging that, you know, that energy into something productive for us all to like look further into, is what I was going to say.
Right. Alexis?
Yes, I was going to say something around those lines. Just thank you for taking the time to be here with us. And I feel like it's very important to, you know, be in these spaces and have these very intense conversations. But yeah, just overall, thank you so much. And just, I feel like it all is in the power of like love and empathy and being able to, you know, challenge different notions. So yes, thank you.
Allison?
I would just want to say keep fighting the fight on free speech and keep writing your work, because now I have a bunch of new readings and stuff to read because of you. Thank you.
Nick?
First, I want to say thank you, for taking the time to talk to us. And I'd agree with Allison. I've got a lot of, very interesting, works of yours that I want to, get a hold of and take a look at. I guess I would say mostly, choose, as I kind of brought up earlier, integrity over ideology. And this is something that I've had to deal with, and I've had to see a lot of my friends deal with is, are my, values and the things that I stand for universal if people that I may disagree with, also, want and stand for those things, and kind of how to reconcile that, and, just, keep thinking about that.
Thank you. And Dory?
May I just start off with thank you for your time, Professor Armour. Actually, I did a little bit of research on you when we found out we were going to have a talk with you, and I was actually very excited, and I'm still excited to even just to get to meet you and know your story and know, your take on what's going on in the world right now. And it's definitely opened my eyes to a few things as well. And as a future law student, actually, I'm inspired more to continue my studies and want to go into this world of change and bring change to the community.
And Professor Armour, what would you like to offer our young participants today, if you could give them a little bit of advice for the future?
You know, this has been a moment of grace for me. You know, I am a living legacy of a jailhouse lawyer. You know, my dad was given 22 to 55 years in state penitentiary for possession and sale of marijuana, and had to teach himself the law, appeal his way out, and I teach his case now in my criminal law class, Armour versus Salisbury, that he triumphed in and established his citizenship. You know, this is why he believed in the country, was able to draw on the Constitution. And so you give me hope. You know, looking at you, sometimes I get a little, you know, I can lose a little bit of my optimism, you know, because you get this steady drumbeat of bad news. Then you get some really sterling good news, like the protests in the street last summer resulted in a new DA, Gascon, progressive prosecutor, and Measure J, which was essentially 10%, a kind of defund the police measure. The activists, what they did in the street translated into real activity, and they were y'all. They were, you know, they were y'all's age cohorts, right? The teenagers and the 20-somethings. And now I'm just feeling rejuvenated. I'm glad we had a chance to chat today.
Yeah. Well, I am so thrilled that we had this opportunity too, and I want to also mention your most recent book, N*GGA Theory, the story of race, language, and social justice. Definitely reading material for all of you, and I am just thrilled that we had this time together, so thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you all. All right. And that is a wrap on this Protest and Promise.